Ah oui, il y a des gens qui arrivent. Participants. Ouais, ils se connectent. 11, 11, 12.
Eh bien, bienvenue et bonjour à toutes et tous pour ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu. Alors, pour ceux qui parlent anglais ou qui n'écoutent que l'anglais, vous disposez d'une translation, une traduction simultanée, donc profitez-en. Il faut cliquer en bas à droite et donc ça permet de fluidifier comme ça les échanges. Et puis après les exposés qu'on va vous proposer, il y aura un temps de questions-réponses à partir d'à peu près de 15 heures qui vous permettra d'échanger avec les experts qu'on a mobilisés. Alors ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu du 5 juin, il est atypique. Il est atypique parce que déjà, je dois excuser l'absence du président Saint-Denis, président de l'association Plan Bleu, qui a un agenda très chargé en juin, mais aussi et surtout parce que ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu, il est partenarial et j'allais dire confraternel. L'idée, c'est de travailler avec ceux qui travaillent sur la biodiversité, sur l'environnement et de valoriser le travail de l'écosystème en faveur des zones humides. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes le 5 juin. Le 5 juin, c'est la journée mondiale de l'environnement. Et pour fêter cette journée, nous avons choisi de parler de biodiversité et en particulier de restauration et de conservation des zones humides. Alors pour ce faire, on a invité, et on en est très heureux, j'allais dire, une sorte de grande sœur du Grand Bleu, la Tour du Valat, représentée par son directeur général, Jean Jalbert, et un certain nombre de ses collaborateurs, de ses collègues. Depuis 70 ans, la Tour du Valat, elle travaille à la connaissance, à la gestion, à la restauration des zones humides. Vous êtes fondé en Camargue, au cœur, si je puis dire, de l'action. Et on est très heureux de vous accueillir et de faire ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu avec vous. Vous êtes les gardiens d'une convention internationale qui s'appelle la Convention de Ramsar, 1971, sur la conservation et la gestion des zones humides. Nous, on est les gardiens d'une convention méditerranéenne qui s'appelle la Convention de Barcelone, 76, sur la gestion de la mer et du littoral méditerranéen. Et donc, on est fait pour s'entendre et pour travailler ensemble, et on travaille déjà ensemble depuis de longues années. Donc, sans plus attendre, je vais passer la parole à mon collègue Jean Jalbert, directeur général, pour qu'il nous parle de la Tour du Valat et puis aussi du pourquoi on s'intéresse aux zones humides. Et ensuite, suivront un certain nombre d'experts qui nous parleront de l'Observatoire des zones humides, qui nous parleront de la gestion des zones humides. Et puis après, on ira vers la séquence des questions-réponses. Sergent, je te passe la parole.
Merci Robin, bonjour à toutes et à tous. C'est un réel plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui et comme tu l'as dit Robin, un plaisir décuplé par ce partenariat de longue date historique entre le Plan Bleu et la Tour du Valat sur des sujets au cœur des enjeux du bassin méditerranéen, à la convergence de ces deux conventions, Convention de Barcelone et Convention de Ramsar, l'une dédiée à un espace géographique, le bassin méditerranéen, l'autre dédiée à une thématique, la zone humide. Et c'est bien au croisement de ces deux enjeux que nous vous proposons de débattre aujourd'hui. La Tour du Valat, je pense que je ne vais pas en dire plus parce que tu as déjà présenté ce que nous sommes, hein, mais juste pour paraphraser un tout petit peu, nous sommes un institut de recherche pour la conservation des zones humides du bassin méditerranéen. Nous sommes basés en Camargue. Nous avons 70 ans d'existence que nous célébrerons à la fin de ce mois. Et nous sommes non seulement un institut de recherche, mais c'est vraiment pour la conservation. C'est-à-dire que nous gérons, nous avons 3000 hectares de terrain en Camargue sur lequel nous avons à la fois une réserve naturelle, donc de la protection, mais aussi notre credo, c'est réconcilier les hommes et la nature, faire en sorte que cette nature ne soit pas mise sous cloche, mais bien puisse servir toutes ces ressources, ces aménités à l'humanité, et notamment celle du bassin méditerranéen. Alors, aujourd'hui, on va parler de la restauration des zones humides. Les intervenants qui arrivent vont parler de comment restaurer. Moi, je voudrais juste vous dire quelques mots sur pourquoi restaurer les zones humides. Ces zones humides, vous le savez peut-être, c'est l'écosystème, un des écosystèmes les plus productifs de cette planète en termes de biodiversité, en termes de ressources. Et par conséquent, c'est l'écosystème sur la planète qui contribue le plus au développement et à la subsistance de l'humanité. Mais ce qui est assez étonnant et paradoxal, c'est que c'est également l'écosystème qui est le plus détruit par cette même humanité qui en bénéficie. Une étude a montré qu'entre un peu plus de 50 ans, un peu moins de 50 ans, entre 1970 et 2018, Eh bien, à l'échelle mondiale, 35% des zones humides ont été rayées de la carte. Nous avons fait, et Anis Gelmami pourra en parler, je pense, nous avons fait le même calcul à l'échelle du bassin méditerranéen, et c'est encore plus préoccupant puisque c'est quasiment la moitié des zones humides du bassin méditerranéen qui ont disparu durant cette période. Donc on voit que ce bassin méditerranéen n'échappe pas et même vit de façon encore plus dramatique cette perte massive de zones humides. Et cette perte, eh bien, en fait, on peut dire c'est une perte de biodiversité, certes, c'est une perte d'usage, certes, mais on s'aperçoit au fil des ans, et notamment avec les effets du changement climatique qui sont de plus en plus forts, étant entendu que le bassin méditerranéen, c'est un triple point chaud, c'est un point chaud de biodiversité, mais c'est également un point chaud du développement humain, et enfin, c'est un point chaud du changement climatique, puisque ce réchauffement est à peu près 20% plus rapide qu'ailleurs sur la planète, que la moyenne sur la planète. Et bien, donc, dans ce contexte, on s'aperçoit de plus en plus que ces zones humides sont des solutions fondées sur la nature de premier ordre pour faire face justement à tous ces défis du réchauffement climatique, de la sécurité alimentaire, de l'approvisionnement, du risque et de la santé. Et donc, il est urgent non seulement de conserver les zones humides existantes, mais on voit qu'aujourd'hui, ce qui reste en Méditerranée sur la planète, c'est un peu une portion congrue. Mais donc, au-delà de la conservation et de la gestion durable des zones humides existantes, l'enjeu clé, l'enjeu majeur des années et des décennies devant nous, c'est bien de restaurer massivement ces zones humides pour qu'elles puissent à nouveau jouer pleinement à la fois cette capacité d'approvisionnement, de bien-être, mais aussi ce rôle d'amortisseur climatique, en quelque sorte d'assurance-vie pour l'humanité face aux grands défis de ce siècle. Voilà ce que je voulais dire pour juste introduire. Je ne voudrais pas être beaucoup plus long et je vais passer la parole de suite pour une première session sur les observatoires à deux personnes, deux experts de la question, Anis Gelmami de l'Observatoire des zones humides méditerranéennes et Antoine Lafitte, donc responsable de l'Observatoire du Plan Bleu. Merci.
Merci, thank you. Merci, Jean. So I will speak in English, and I will start by presenting the main key findings from the Mediterranean Wetlands Observatory. Next slide, please. So why we are focusing on the Mediterranean Basin? As you probably know, the Mediterranean Basin is one of the 36 biodiversity hotspots. Within the basin, wetlands cover only 2 to 3% of the total area, but they host at least or almost a third of the Mediterranean species, and they have also very high rate of endemism. We estimate that 40% of the species that are linked to the Mediterranean wetlands are endemic. Next slide, please. And we have in the Mediterranean wetlands, we have a very wide and large range of diversity in terms of habitats, from natural wetlands in all the biomes, in coastal areas, but also inland wetlands in arid and semi-arid zones. And we have also, next slide, please. We have also a very wide range of artificial or human-made wetlands. So all the diversity and of habitats, and also the biodiversity that they host, they offer a lot of services. So next slide, please. So the Mediterranean wetlands, we estimate that, for instance, the carbon sequestration, they contribute a lot to the carbon sequestration, and we estimate that their contribution is 10 to 20% or 20 times higher than the temperate boreal forest. They also contribute to flood regulation and flood protection by absorbing the excess of water and limit the runoff, and also contribute to the groundwater, to the recharge of groundwater tables. And they are also a hotspot for recreation and human well-being. And this is just some examples of the very wide range of all ecosystem services that they provide. However, next slide, please. The Mediterranean wetlands are also highly threatened by human activities. As Jean was mentioning, we estimate that during the last 5 decades, we've lost almost 50%, so half of the natural wetlands in the Mediterranean basin, and freshwater species has decreased by 28% between 1993 and 2016. So as you can see, the threats are really here, and they are affecting and impacting massively wetland habitats. Next slide, please. So We have different level of threats. One of them is the overexploitation of water resources, like here, for instance, in the Akshehir Lake. You can see in this example that the overexploitation of surface water, underground water, is dramatically impacting the lake, and we estimate from our observations that natural wetlands are receiving less and less water, so which influence their surface water dynamics by transforming the permanently flooded wetlands into temporary flooded wetlands, or even to their disappearance and total dry out. And this situation is not only for this case study in Turkey, but we are observing a lot of wetlands all over the Mediterranean wetlands that are suffering from this water shortage. Next slide, please. So the situation is very alarming, and we have now the restoration and the restoration efforts that are under spotlight. And we have also an increased social and political demand for nature restoration. For example, the 2030 target of the CBD aims to restore 30% of the degraded ecosystems all over the world. And we have also increasing financial resources for wetlands restoration. So let's start now thinking about restoring wetlands and restoring massively the nature and ecological restoration all over the Mediterranean. Next slide, please. And for this purpose, we are developing at the Mediterranean Wetlands Observatory plenty of tools. Some of them are dedicated to the estimation or the mapping of potentially restorable wetlands. So based on different tools that we are using, including Earth observation tool, we can, for instance, highlight areas where wetlands have been destroyed or wetlands have been transformed into other habitats. And by this estimation or this mapping, we can recommend some restoration priorities or prioritize areas for wetlands restoration and wetlands restoration activities and sites. Next slide, please. And all this knowledge and all this data are integrated into a knowledge baseline that is developed under the Mediterranean Wetlands Observatory. So we are working, for instance, on the development of the geoportal, which will be released soon, where all this information and data will be gathered, collected, and shared with all the stakeholders and the users all over the Mediterranean basin. But we are also working on in feeding other existing regional platforms, like the platform that is developed now by the Plan Bleu and the regional observatory of Plan Bleu. And here I will give the floor to Antoine Lafitte to talk more about this observatory.
Attendez, tout est OK? C'est bon pour vous? Donc je vais m'exprimer en français. Je m'excuse par avance, je suis un peu pris du nez, donc excusez ma voix nasillarde. Donc l'Observatoire du Plan Bleu, de grande partie, il s'agit de connaître et de comprendre tout ce qui a trait aux phénomènes naturels, de surveiller ces phénomènes naturels, d'une part, et d'autre part, de faire connaître et de partager nos analyses au travers d'outils de visualisation via des outils de partage de données géospatiales et statistiques. Pourquoi? Pour appuyer le processus de décision. Alors, notre travail s'inclut précisément et presque exclusivement dans le cadre du PNUE PAM, le plan d'action pour la Méditerranée, et notamment le suivi de la mise en œuvre de la stratégie méditerranéenne pour le développement durable. Mais nos activités de l'Observatoire s'inscrivent également dans d'autres contextes. Ça a été évoqué en introduction par les directeurs du Plan Bleu et de la Tour du Valat. Et aussi, je le montrerai tout à l'heure, nos activités contribuent aux travaux de l'Observatoire des zones humides méditerranéennes. Prochaine slide, merci. Alors, en termes d'outils, ce que nous avons, c'est donc la possibilité de visualiser de la donnée en implantation surfacique, c'est-à-dire de la donnée spatialisée, géospatialisée. Ici, ce que vous avez à l'écran, c'est donc une carte régionale qui vous présente l'étendue et la localisation des zones humides en Méditerranée, selon une classification bien précise donnée par la Convention de Ramsar. et en l'occurrence pour cette carte, précisément, selon une unité de projection et une résolution spécifique. Alors, un autre point qui est intéressant, parce que l'idée ici, c'est pas de vous faire une démonstration sur les zones humides, mais bien d'illustrer des fonctionnalités offertes par l'Observatoire du Plan Bleu en utilisant le thème des zones humides, qui est le thème de ces rendez-vous du Plan Bleu aujourd'hui. Cette carte a été réalisée par une université, donc l'université de Malaga, qui est aussi un topic center, un centre de compétences de l'Agence européenne de l'environnement. Et ces données sont partagées via un service web, d'où l'acronyme WMS, Web Map Service, qui veut dire concrètement que les données sont hébergées au sein de l'université de Malaga et sont partagées via l'outil Observatoire du Plan Bleu. Next slide, prochaine slide. Alors ici, une autre carte, donc à une échelle plus fine, hein, une échelle locale. Vous reconnaîtrez donc le sud de la France et plus précisément la zone de la Camargue. Alors ici, cette carte, elle vous montre le niveau de risque auquel sont confrontées les zones humides méditerranéennes françaises par le risque de submersion. Selon le scénario ici, un scénario optimiste de plus 44 cm de hausse du niveau de la mer d'ici 2100. Et cet exemple, alors pour montrer d'une part une nouvelle fonctionnalité de l'outil, mais aussi pour vous montrer que dans ce cas précis, cette carte a été produite et publiée au sein de l'Observatoire du Plan Bleu grâce à un partenariat entre la Tour du Valat, le Plan Bleu et puis naturellement le Muséum d'histoire naturelle français. Et je tiens à souligner la collaboration excellente avec Fabien Verniès, qui peut être présent parmi les participants. Donc on vous livre là en primeur une réalisation récente du Plan Bleu. Prochaine étape. Alors, vous avez un QR code sur la droite de l'écran. Vous pouvez le scanner avec votre téléphone, à condition que vous continuiez d'écouter la suite des exposés. Autrement, saisissez-le simplement et puis ensuite vous irez naviguer sur l'observatoire. Il y a aussi une petite démonstration. Ça va pas fonctionner. Bon, simplement pour vous montrer que en plus, c'est les aléas techniques. Vous aurez donc la présentation, tous les participants, vous pourrez cliquer, mais je vais quand même pouvoir vous délivrer une autre information que je voulais partager via cet outil, c'est qu'on a des données géospatiales, on a aussi des données statistiques, c'est ce que je disais dans ma première présentation, on a la possibilité aussi de visualiser de la donnée, non seulement de manière géospatiale, mais aussi statistique sous la forme de graphiques interactifs que vous pouvez consulter. Alors, je vous invite à scanner le QR code. Rendez-vous sur l'Observatoire du Plan Bleu et cette application web. Naviguez, consultez, c'est gratuit, c'est très intuitif, en accès libre. Et je suis là, naturellement, pour répondre à toutes vos questions. Et j'ai le plaisir maintenant de passer la parole à mon collègue Arnaud à ma gauche, qui va vous présenter quelques éléments de contexte et d'objectifs et de résultats du projet Waterlands, qui est un projet que nous menons avec plusieurs partenaires, dont la Tour du Valat. Merci.
Merci Antoine. Thank you very much. I will speak in English for this presentation. And let me start by saying that this presentation will focus around governance, so less on the ecological aspects and functionalities of wetlands, but more on the conditions that allow restoration of wetlands. So we can move to the next slide. Just to give you a bit of context, we basically did a study as part of the Waterlands project. Waterlands is H2020 Green Deal co-project that started in 2021 and is running until 2026. We have about 32 partners from 14 countries, and Plan Bleu is very much involved in the aspect of aligning governance. We can move to the next slide. So as we saw before, previous attempts at wetland restoration have often been too localized or fragmented to make, let's say, a difference in how ecosystems are being reestablished as well as species. Waterlands aims to co-create more effective restoration, which captures not only ecological, social and governance aspects, but also financial financial flows, let's say, to connect habitats and communities across Europe. The main human threats that affected wetlands within the project pilot sites. So here we have, as you see on the map, 15 knowledge sites. So these sites are called knowledge sites because they have implemented wetland restoration projects and have generated knowledge, which we're using to support the action sites, the 6 action sites of the project, where currently we're having restoration works. We will see that more with the Venice presentation from our colleague at We Are Here Venice. Just to say that we have also good coverage of Ramsar sites at the European scale. We can move to the next slide. Well, the context of this study is that Plan Bleu was tasked with characterizing supportive governance and policy. And here we published in September 2023 the study that really looked at what are the policy and governance conditions that contribute to successful wetland restoration, based on different aspects, such as the comprehensive literature review that we performed, also deep analysis of governance for, let's say, a first selection of the knowledge sites of the project, so 6 of them, and then we extended to the other sites further interviews and service. We also mapped the key EU national and regional policies that allowed us to understand what is the framework that support restoration at the moment at EU scale. What we came up with is 3 pillars of ideal governance, where we identified, let's say, the good ingredients that can support restoration from an economic, social, but also environmental perspective. We can move to the next slide, please. I wanted to present you some of the findings that we have in this report, and also what we identify in terms of models. So some of the success factors that we identified through the knowledge site experience, let's say, is that, for example, the presence of authorities that promoted or carried out land acquisition from private owners was a pre-requirement to perform restoration. Also, the presence of a multi-stakeholder committee represented by both decision makers and other interested parties was a key characteristic of successful projects. Also, political and funding support from the government, recognizing the ecological value of the wetlands. But we also identified limiting factors. And here they were highlighted very much in the knowledge site experience through the lack of an overarching strategy and long-term perspective when it comes to restoration. And the vision of stakeholders. We often have conflicting interests, which are jeopardizing, let's say, the potential restoration of wetlands. So the vision and the ability to ensure continuity and coherence of actions over time, and to balance different needs and goals is one of the limiting factors. What I can tell you also is that the conflictual coexistence of multiple actors and interests with multiple uses hindered let's say the restoration of wetlands in some of the sites. So, well, land ownership is a big issue. The presence of scattered land ownership with different tenure rights and with limited interest in achieving restoration goals is one of the main limiting factor. In this study, we have also, let's say, an annex part where you have the fact sheets, where you can see in details the governance structure of the different knowledge sites of the project. But we came up also with 4 main theoretical models of governance. And so we compared them to the knowledge sites governance experience. And in the next slide, we can see the 4 governance models here, where based on this analysis, we saw that they're very heterogeneous. There's no one-size-fits-for-all model, unfortunately, that can be expanded to restoration of different ecosystems. It's very site-specific. Some of the sites have highly specific features, but we identified 4 models: the polycentric model, the community-based model, the monocentric one, and the networking model. This was possible based on the in-depth analysis that we performed on 6 of the sites. We can move to the next slide. Going back to the governance framework that we established in this report and the 3 pillars that I mentioned before, here you can see more in details what they consist in. We have a pillar more on co-creation and communication, and one more on the design and implementation with stakeholders agreeing on a set of principles and rules to guide restoration efforts. And then a 3rd pillar, which is more on the long-term vision, ensuring that the restoration lasts over time, in time and space, through different approaches and tools. So we have formulated recommendations for policymakers, also possible actions that are, let's say, generalized and can be transferred to other sites. It can be a blueprint, let's say, to support restoration of wetlands that have not started. And we have also illustrated this report with examples of good practices from the knowledge side to support practitioners. And we can move to the next slide. Because in our opinion, at this time, there are 2 major challenges remaining from what we saw. One is associated really with the disconnection that we see between those who culturally value ecosystems at local scale and those who have authority in an environmental governance domain. They need to be reconnected to really, let's say, bear fruits when it comes to restoration of ecosystems, not just wetlands, but in general. And what we heard from the knowledge sites practitioners is that climate change is another big issue. It's common to all of them, and it's becoming increasingly relevant. So to conclude, we can move to the next slide. Who can benefit from this study? Well, I mentioned the policymakers or decision makers to really support them in designing and shaping environmental policies related to wetland restoration. But also on the ground, environmental managers, monitoring manager, or restoration practitioner who need concrete ideas or recommendations to improving governance on their wetland site. But also the members of local community who need guidance and need to better understand governance structure and how they fit in the process. So I will stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the study or any governance related aspects. But I will then pass the floor to my colleague at Tour du Valat, Lisa Ernoul, who will present more in details the Camargue knowledge sites. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to first begin by thanking Plan Bleu for inviting us to participate in this webinar. I think it's a great opportunity to work together and continue our collaboration, and also to share a little bit of our experiences that we're doing on the Waterlands project. So thank you very much. Next slide. So the case study from the Waterlands project in the Camargue is actually a multitude of sites. We, as John mentioned in the introduction, the Tour du Valat has been working on wetland management and restoration for over 70 years in the Camargue, and we have many different sites where we're working. And each of these sites has a very specific way of working and dealing with the management and the restoration, depending on the context. So even though we're talking about a fairly small region, if you look at the entire Mediterranean basin, within the Camargue, we're looking even more at small specific context to see how to best work with the local stakeholders and how to best implement the different conservation actions. So here you can see we have about 10 different projects, restoration projects in the Camargue. And today I'm just going to talk about 3 of them and how we adapt the different governance models in each of these 3 sites. Next slide, please. So for each of the sites, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ownership, the type of governance that we put in place, and then just to kind of highlight the advantages and the difficulties of each of these different models. Next slide, please. So the first site that I'd like to talk about is this Tour du Valat estate. The Tour du Valat estate for us, of course, is a very special place. We have almost 4,000 hectares of natural reserve, where we're able to have an open air laboratory where we can really test different practices for wetland conservation and management. Our estate as it's privately owned, and we're doing the management itself, is fairly easy to put in place, but we do have a steering committee that's made up of local funders and governance bodies. The steering committee meets once a year and really sets the framework for how we can work and what activities we can implement. And since it is a reserve, we are quite restricted in the way that we can manage, and we have a very strict binding agreement to limit the activities that we can have on the reserve. So within the Tour du Valat estate, we have managed the land for now over 70 years, but there's certain areas where we have been able to do more concrete restoration, and others just more management activities. The advantages of working on your own land and having just a small steering committee is that we have complete control of the management process in the decision-making process. So although we do have some other actors who work and live on the land, we have other livestock operators who come and they're able to keep their livestock, but we're able to make all of the rules and the regulations about how to manage that land. But one of the difficulties of having that complete control is at the same time, we have the full responsibility, including the human resources and the financial obligations. And it's also a very long-term project. It's not a small project that you just do in 2 or 3 years and you're finished. One of the other difficulties is because it's our own land and we're managing as we see best for the wetland conservation. At times we can have conflicts with other local stakeholders, feeling that we're not managing the land as it should be done properly in the Camargue because we're testing new models. And sometimes it can cause a little bit of conflict between the Tour du Valat estate and the local stakeholders. Next slide, please. So a second site that we're working on is called the Former Saltworks of the Camargue. And this is a site that is owned by the Conservatoire du Littoral, which is the French agency for the conservation of the coastal areas. This land was bought by the Conservatoire du Littoral about 12 years ago now, and it's about 6,000 hectares. And the Tour du Valat is a co-manager in restoring or renaturalizing this area. There are 2 other co-managers. It's the Natural Regional Park of the Camargue and the Reserve of Camargue. And the 3 co-managers work together with the landowner to develop a management plan and a management strategy and actually manage the restoration activities of the entire saltworks. This co-management is really interesting because it allows each of the different structures to use to the best of their abilities, their capacities, whether they be scientific, more management, more consultation, or more business oriented, to work together for the same land. This co-management has also been very interesting, bringing in many other stakeholders who are living and working in the area. So although the management is really based up of the 3 co-managers and the owner, there's also a steering committee made up of other important stakeholders that come together at least once a year to help direct the direction of the management. And just recently, this steering committee was quite active in developing a new management plan for the site. So one of the advantages of having this co-management is that, as I said, we can have a collaboration between other experts. So you don't have to have just one organization who has all of the experience and all of the knowledge. And you can also have a shared responsibility, especially for the human resources, the financial contributions, and also the communications. One of the difficulties of working in this co-management is also maintaining this collaboration over time. So a lot of times at the beginning of a restoration project, you have a lot of interest or you have a decent amount of funding, but to maintain that same kind of implication over time is not always easy. And as the different political willingness changes between the organizations, it can have an impact on the management and on the co-management and the relationships between. So far, like I said, this site has been very interesting to be able to test new methodologies as far as restoration and renaturalization on a very large scale, especially for the Mediterranean area. So as far as restoration, physical restoration, we've been able to test many activities, but this co-management is also one of the things we've been able to test and contribute to the report that Arnaud just talked about in the previous presentation. Next slide, please. So the third project I'd like to talk about is called the Verde Marshes. The Verde Marshes is on a much smaller scale. It's only 100 hectares, and it's also based in the Camargue. And this project was developed about 15 years ago now. It was a former fish pond that was bought with the idea of having a community-based restoration project and management project with the local hamlet of the Sambuc. The hamlet of the Sambuc is only made up of about 500 families, so it's a quite small community. But the idea was to bring the people from the community together to help encourage them and show them the importance of wetlands and get them involved in the management of the site. And so they could take their practices, implement them here on this 100 hectares, but also take them outside of the 100 hectares and replicate them in their other areas where they live and work and play in the Camargue. So this type of governance, we call it community-based governance, and the site is managed by a local association. Today we have about 60 members, official members in the association. We have a lot less real active members. And the community members, they come together once a month to do different different activities to restore the wetlands. Here in the photo, you can see the local school children came and they made a hedge along the trail to provide shade in the summertime. The community members have built local observatories. They help maintain the site as far as keeping the area open and getting rid of invasive species. And all of the activities that are done on the site are community-based, and the community members can use the site to have their own courses on the site, or to do bird watching, or to do hiking. So the members who are involved, they are active in the management, but they also get the benefits of having a site that's in proximity to them, that's free access, that they can use any time of the year. This project is a really beautiful project. And some of the advantages are that there's a very strong implication of the local stakeholders, which can help reduce conflicts, especially when there's questions about how the Camargue in general should be managed, how water should be managed, about recently with the relationships between the farmers and the environmentalists. So this type of project really helps reduce those conflicts and have direct contact between the environmental sector and the local actors. The other advantage is that, as I mentioned, the different practices that we have on the Verde Marshes, whether it be for hunting or whether it be for invasive species, these different activities that they practice on the Verde Marshes can be practiced again outside of the Verde Marshes on the other wetlands in the Camargue. One of the difficulties I'd like to mention, although I said it's a very beautiful project, it requires a very high level of time and financial input. And again, this type of project, it's very motivating at the beginning. You can get a lot of community members and financial support to put in place a project like this, but it has to go over time. And if the community members are really excited for 3 years or 4 years, and then the funding stops, and then there's no longer this type of community-based management, it causes a lot of frustration for the local community. So if anybody is considering doing a community-based restoration or management project, it's really important to look at the advantages, but to look at the investment that's needed, not just in the short term, but over a very middle to long-term process, to ensure that not only the wetlands are managed how they should be, but also to ensure that the people who are participating in these projects are satisfied throughout the process. Just to let you know, for the project, like I said, it's going on for almost 15 years, and it needs to have at least one full-time project manager in the beginning stages, and then even in the middle stages, a half-time manager, to really ensure the not only the physical management of the site, but the financial components and the community involvements components as well. Next slide, please. So just basically, these are 3 small projects that I wanted to mention that the Tour du Valat has been implementing with quite different governance models. As a conclusion, I'd like to say that the governance models must really be adapted to each specific case, as Arnaud also mentioned in the study. There's not a one size fits all, or this is the best practice and needs to be replicated in all of the sites. Each specific site must consider the social and economic conditions, the political willingness, the time and human resources necessary to put in place these different models. And it's also important to take into account that each of these models might change over time as we're talking about not short-term projects, but middle to long-term projects. Some of the governance might move from a more community-based to a more steering committee approach, or vice versa, depending on how the situation changes in each of the specific cases. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to now pass the floor to Margherita, who will talk from We Are Here Venice about a case from Venice.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me also with the translation. I would like to thank Plan Bleu for the invite and everybody for being here. Today, I would like to present We Are Here Venice, and within the context of the Waterlands project, the Venice Action Site. Thank you. We Are Here Venice is an NGO founded in 2015. And the mission for We Are Here Venice is to maintain the city and the lagoon as a living city, as a living ecosystem, and advocating for an evidence-based approach to policymaking, where most of the evidence come from the community and the residents' population, and of course, science. Everybody knows Venice for its monumental and cultural heritage, but we need to know the city for its ecosystem that supports the city itself, as they are 2 inseparable elements of this socio-ecological system we're in. So as a practice, we collaborate with very different entities, but always based on rigorous research to bring about real changes for Venice, but then they can eventually be replicated in other wetlands contexts mostly. Next slide, please. So a little bit of context about Venice indeed, because some people might not know that the Lagoon of Venice is the biggest coastal wetland in the Mediterranean basin. So it's a very big ecosystem that is experiencing, as all the other Mediterranean wetlands, extensive salt marsh losses. We have now around 70% of the salt marshes lost from the original state. This is due to natural but also anthropogenic causes. But the main threat is that the lagoon system is characterized by a severe lack of sediments moving with the water. This means that the vertical accretion of the salt marshes is under threat because of erosion, sea level rise, but also because there are no more sediments to feed this ecosystem made of water, plants, and vegetation altogether. We have very different, as I said, causes. Some of the most important are that in the past, during the Serenissima Republic, while they were taking care of the management of the lagoon, as the threat was the opposite. So there was the risk of the lagoon being sealed up. they diverged the main rivers that used to bring the sediments, and in order to develop the industrial port in Venice, over the last century, they dredged a lot of channels, big channels in the lagoon, changing the morphological equilibrium of the system. Next slide, please. So the project within the context of waterlands is, as Arnaud said, is an action site. So we are currently delivering a restoration project. But you all should know that most of the restoration, morphological restoration carried out in the lagoon are delivered by the public state, the government, the Italian government, by the Port Authority or the Ministry of the Infrastructure. So this means that the morphological structures within the lagoon are being restored and reconstructed. However, some very important details related to ecological functioning of the reconstructed infills are not really considered within the design and the monitoring after the operations. And so there is the potential of an additionality from the Waterlands project and the scale up of the project in order to include the ecological functionalities within the design and the monitoring, and and very importantly also to include a participatory approach in both in all the stages of the project. So then there is what we call co-creation, both at the operation but also at the legacy point of view. So the population got they are affected, but also affects the restoration project. And finally, in order to really talk about a scale up at a landscape level, so a socioeconomic landscape level too, we need to implement and integrate a more adaptive management. This means that the various inputs will make the management plans of the lagoon, and not only at a top-down kind of expert technological point of view. Next slide, please. So just up to show you a little bit of close-up of the lagoon. It's very huge. Most of the northern part is in its natural state, so original marshes. Then we have the central part of the lagoon. We have all, as you can see, down the word Mestre, the city. We have the port, the industrial port, where there used to be all marshes. And as you can see, they have been destroyed for the sake of economic development. And then, as in the action site area, Lago Bastia 2, as you can read, where the red pointer is, we have our action site. And looking at the map on the right, you can see that we have a mixture of natural and artificial marshes. The artificial ones are the recreated morphologies that I talked about before, but some are showing bad conditions. So the operation ended up in bad results, in some intermediate results, and in the intermediate, so where there is something to save, that's where we are operating. Next slide, please. So to link with the study, the Plan Bleu study, and what also Lisa showed about the Camargue, the governance of the Venice, it's very complicated, because the area is a mixture of very different socio-economic activities, and it's not just unfortunately an environment, but it's also a very anthropized environment. So we have, as you can see from, sorry for using an Italian document, but you can see the number and the name of all the entities that operate in the lagoon system. And I will tell you, there are a lot. And so the main problem is that even though there is this kind of polycentric outlook of the governance system, it is rather more monocentric, because most of the financial support, and but also at the top management level, most of the decisions are taken in Rome, so by the central government. This means that there is a very hierarchical system where, again, technical decisions are taken rather than adaptive co-management with all the actors involved within the local territory. And to add, as I said before, there are some kind of power imbalances, because most of the local community and local representative are not taken into consideration when drafting plans or evaluating the results of such projects. The elephant in the room is that the key management plans, namely the Protocollo Fanghi, so the sediment protocol, and the actual morphological plan, so aimed at maintaining the morphological equilibrium or restoring what is needed, are delayed since long time. And because by the various entities, the various actors hardly find like a consensus on what has to be done and who has to pay for it, basically. So, and to add all this, to all this complexity, we have a very, very big lack of transparency and information sharing between the relevant authorities. This means not only that the authorities do not disclose the plans to the local community, to the electors, let's say, but also among the authorities, they do not cooperate because they do not share information and data. And the question to add ourselves is if there is a one-way relationship between the authorities and such type of project, so as the Waterlands project, as we need always to question if they do recognize the value of this additionality that I talked about before. Next slide, please. So, but let's not talk about only the problems, but let's try to find a solution. And we do believe, as the Green Deal also suggests, that the engagement of the local community and the key stakeholders could be a key to try to bring out some consensus and create more stable relationships between the authorities and the local community. So we are promoting this participatory approach, and to do so, we firstly wanted to value what is less valued or what is less visible for the authorities. And you can see here this map, but then you can also discover it online, typing Voices of the Lagoon story map, because we map the cultural ecosystem services, let's call the values, the experiences, the emotions that the local representatives attach to the places of the lagoon. So then to what we call create this bottom-up squeeze, that is to make the reduce the distance between the expectation of the local community, but also the duties and the plans of the authorities. So to kind of make them closer and closer. Next slide, please. And to add this, we need to educate the next the young citizen and the next local community in the way that they understand the value of the lagoon, but also they understand their role in the lagoon. So they are not just spectators, but they are actors as just being a citizen of this ecosystem. So we we created a citizen science educational program that at this let's say at this pilot version last year, we had like 120 participants of young students from the local schools. And this year we kind of double the number of participants in order to emphasize the need of having such kind of programs within the school, the local schools, again, to educate the next generation to take care of their environment. Next slide. Questions, and I thank you all for listening to me, and that's all.
Merci Margherita, merci à tous les intervenants qui ont présenté lors de cette heure sur la restauration des zones humides. Pour tous les participants, vous pouvez maintenant poser vos questions soit à l'un des intervenants en précisant son nom dans le petit onglet en bas où il est marqué Q&A, question and answer. Et on va prendre la première question qui est adressée de Constantin Sakas, merci beaucoup, qui est adressée à Lisa. Lisa, you mentioned how financial input was a challenge. Could we think of ways of banks get eyes to better adapt their lending and investment criteria to more actively support wetland restoration projects? Also, are new financial instruments such as wetland impact bond sufficiently developed to attract private capital to wetland restoration projects? Any successful example that we can adapt in the Mediterranean context? Lisa de la Tour du Valat, si vous voulez répondre.
Would you like me to read the question and try to answer that?
Yes, if you have a start of answer to give us, Lisa.
Yeah, it's a very little start. So the question was about financial input. As I mentioned in my presentation, it is a challenge. And the question was, could we think of different ways to better adapt banks or IFIs to better invest in wetland restoration projects? Or are there other financial instruments such as wetland impact bonds that could be useful for the restoration projects? And maybe how could we adapt these examples to the Mediterranean context? So just as a very, very beginning part of this answer, because I'm definitely not an expert on the question, what we have seen at the Tour du Valat, especially now in the decade of restoration, the actual funding of the restoration projects is always a challenge. It's always a very big amount of money that you need to start the project. But today there seems to be a decent amount of funding opportunities to do the physical, concrete part of the restoration. And what we see is really it's hard to find the funding that continues, or even before the restoration, for the feasibility studies and all of the impact assessments that are necessary. And then after the restoration to really put in place the management activities. Because in the projects, our restoration projects, we can see sometimes we don't really see the impact of the restoration in the first year or even the second year. Some of the temporary ponds, it takes up to 30 years before we can really get into a functioning wetland habitat type that we were looking for. So these are projects that need not only the funding to dig or to do the real physical concrete part, but to really maintain the projects before, to make sure they're scientifically based and sound, but also after the restoration. So for me, that's the biggest challenge, is the before and the after the restoration more than the restoration itself. So as far as the different tools that you mentioned, we at the Tour du Valat do not have specific experience with these tools. But some of the things that could be a little bit related are the payments for ecosystem services that have been tested in the past. And sometimes these payment for ecosystem services are given to private landowners. It could be through agro-environmental plans or different payments that can be through projects to help the farmers or to help the different landowners to restore and then to manage their lands afterwards. So these payments for ecosystem services are one tool that I find could be useful. But within the Waterlands project, we are also trying to test other financial solutions. And of course, it's a European-based project, so it might not be relevant for the entire Mediterranean area. But one of our key partners within the project is called the Landscape Finance Lab, and you can look them up on the internet, and they have quite a few sessions, free sessions and webinars that are available to projects who are interested in looking at alternative ways to finance restoration projects and management projects. So I don't know, I can open it up to any of the other participants in the meeting if you have other experiences dealing with financing restoration activities you'd like to share.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa. I see that there are some hands and also another question, so I will refrain from speaking. I think I've spoken enough. Jean Jalbert, the floor is yours, and then we can go to the next question of Marco. I think it's still for you, Lisa. So Jean, vous pouvez prendre la parole si vous voulez.
Thank you, Arnaud. Just to complement what Lisa just told us regarding the private finance, I may witness that there is a growing interest in private finance actors to invest in wetland restoration. However, the limit is that most of them are looking for a business model, you know, and most of the time it's through carbon offsetting. So they are looking for restoring wetland just for, or mainly for offsetting carbon, for sequestrating carbon in wetland. And this appears to be tricky as just as you said, there is not one governance scheme fitting for every case. It's just the same thing for wetland restoration and carbon sequestration. We can't anticipate and foresee what will be the rate of carbon sequestration in a given restoration project. So we can't have a secured business model for that. And this is a strong limitation for the investments of the private sector in the wetland restoration, as they are most of the time looking for, you know, secured plan for a business model. So growing interest for sure, but very few cases in which they are ready and yes, in a position to invest really.
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you very much also for Lisa for mentioning payment for ecosystem services. Just to give you a small information from our side at Plan Bleu, we're leading a project called Artemis. It's an Interreg project that just started in January 2024, which will be focusing on testing payment for ecosystem services schemes in the context of Posidonia restoration at 4 pilot sites. And indeed, we started from the assumption that there is no market, and that the few tools and market-based instruments that exist are not sufficient, are not mature enough, and focus too much on carbon offsetting to actually bring more private finance into restoration or conservation projects. So starting from this assumption, we will try to test different market-based instruments, not only PES, but also instruments that can address specific ecosystem services, such as blue carbon or biodiversity protection, to see where it takes us. But it's a sort of new journey that we're embarking on. Also, we don't know how to respond to companies' requests that want to invest in projects such as Posidonia restoration. So it's marine-based, but I think there are a lot of parallels to be made with wetlands. I will read out the question of Marco, and I think it's for you, Lisa. Marco said, SLR, so sea level rise, is a serious threat to wetlands submersion. How do you tackle this issue? Are there some nature-based solutions to protect wetlands from sea level rise? And how do you select areas to be restored? Priorities versus submersion in the long term, in Camargue, I guess.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marco, for the question. And it's good to see you here. It's been a while. So looking at nature-based solutions for sea level rise is one of the key topics that we do speak about quite often in the Camargue, especially for that area that I mentioned, the former salt works of the Camargue, because that's one of the areas that is already and will be the most affected in the first term. And it's a big question. Fortunately or unfortunately, that land, we know there's not a lot that we can do to 100% protect it in the future. And the philosophy that we've had is a renaturalization of the site. So when we talk about a renaturalization, it's using the nature-based solutions, accepting that some areas are going to have more erosion and other areas are going to maybe have a different impact where you can have dunes being created. So in these areas where the dunes are created naturally, you're going to be gaining different types of wetland habitats that maybe you would have lost before. And in the past, they had a huge dike to protect the coast. And what we've seen is these huge dikes are very, very expensive. And especially in the low populated areas like wetlands and in the Camargue, we don't have that funding to maintain these dikes. But it's not only a question of funding, it's a question of feasibility. These dikes need to be rebuilt constantly. And with the different currents, we're not able to maintain them. So when we took the decision for the former salt works of the Camargue to do this renaturalization, we accepted there's land that's going to be lost while we're gaining other lands. And we also there's a difference also between the land that is more natural land, that even if you're losing it, you're not going to be having any direct negative impact on human populations. And when the human populations are a real factor, like further up from the former salt works, there are still dikes that need to be maintained, and not necessarily by the Tour du Valat, but there's a syndicate that protects these dikes to protect the human population. So when we're looking at these nature-based solutions for sea level rise, it's really important to look at not only the environmental side, what kind of habitats can you protect or can you try to influence in the future? Which ones are you willing to lose? But also what are the impacts of the sea level rise on the human populations? And then to try and find a balance between the nature-based solutions, the renaturalizations of the site, and also still maintaining some of these gray infrastructures that might be really necessary to protect the populations, at least in the middle term in the future. Another nature-based solution that I think is quite interesting, and it's linked to what Arnaud was just speaking about, is the Posidonia restoration. Sometimes when you have this vegetation a little further out into the sea, you're also reducing the amount of currents and the amount of impact that you might have on your more coastal areas and land areas. So this Posidonia restoration is not only having an impact on the nurseries and the fish in the sea, but it also can be a nature-based solution to help protect the wetlands in the coastal areas. So that's the first part I'd like to contribute. I don't know if any other panelists would like to contribute as well.
Yes, may I add some few words here? Regarding the impact of sea level rise on coastal wetlands, it was also mentioned in the presentation from Antoine that we have conducted with Fabien Vernier, one PhD student, a former PhD student at Tour du Valat, a study on the impact of sea level rise on water birds population in coastal wetlands, and also, as Lisa was mentioning, how we can address the impact of sea level rise on population through promoting coastal wetlands as nature-based solutions. So, of course, working on the protection of wetlands, coastal wetlands in facing sea level rise is one thing, but also using wetlands, coastal wetlands as a barrier to protect people from coastal erosion and sea level rise is also another thing. So in our prioritization work that we are conducting at the level of the Mediterranean basin, we are also looking, as was mentioning, at the vulnerability and also the risk, and how we can address this risk by promoting the restoration of coastal wetlands, coastal nature habitat and coastal wetlands to protect the people and also socioeconomic activities. But knowing that the sea level rise will impact the coastal wetlands by shifting the habitats. So this is another study that we are also conducting at the level of the Mediterranean basin, and we are trying to understand what will be the impact in terms of habitat shifting from freshwater to brackish to saline habitats in the coastal areas. So all this will have a huge impact, and in the future, I think it will be one of the main driver of the socioeconomic activities in the coast, and that's why it should be taken into consideration when we work on the prioritization of areas to be restored. That some changes will happen, and we will take them into consideration when working on the prioritization. So there are some maybe some field of interventions that we can do and we can work on, but in other cases, I think that the sea level rise will be the impact of sea level rise will be too expensive to combat or to face. That's why we should take this also into consideration on all the habitat shifting in the future.
If I can also add something, when we use the word nature-based solution, and this solution, it's already there, like it's already nature. So in our case, but I think in most of the wetlands case, if the ecosystem is a ecological functional status, it can vertically survive the sea level rise. The biggest problem, I think, that I guess we all share is that they are always under threat for other causes, for other problems. So sea level rise can be tackled by nature itself on the spot if they can be functional. And at the landscape level, because we can't think that 1 hectare of restored marsh can save then the whole ecosystem, but altogether the landscape can find the solution itself.
Merci beaucoup, Margherita. Si l'un des intervenants veut rajouter quelque chose, ou si l'un des participants a encore une ou deux questions, il nous reste encore quelques minutes.
Une fois, 2 fois, 3 fois? Écoutez, à moins qu'il y ait une question rentrée là dans les toutes dernières secondes, moi je tiens déjà à vous remercier, Jean Jalbert et ton équipe, pour nous avoir rejoints dans ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu dédié aux zones humides. Merci beaucoup à tous pour vos interventions, à la fois statistiques, cartographiques, et puis concrètes sur le terrain, de comment on gère, ou mal, ou bien, les zones humides. Alors, ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu et ce que vous avez entendu, ça a pu, par certains côtés, vous surprendre, parce qu'on n'a pas parlé de flamant rose, on n'a pas parlé de roselière, on a parlé de gouvernance, on a parlé de financement, on a un peu parlé d'éducation. Une zone humide, c'est d'abord un espace, et il n'est de terre sans maître. Donc, c'est déjà des propriétaires, c'est des usagers avec lesquels il faut composer et trouver des moyens d'une gestion raisonnable de ces zones humides. Donc, c'est des questions de gouvernance. Et pour protéger ces milieux humides, il faut déjà accorder les parties prenantes autour de ces milieux humides. Et c'est l'enjeu de ce projet Waterlands qu'on a beaucoup évoqué avec Arnaud et Lisa, d'essayer de trouver les modèles, ou en tout cas les bonnes pratiques pour gérer en harmonie ces espaces. Mais il n'y a pas de miracle, hein. La gestion des espaces naturels, ça coûte un peu d'argent, ne serait-ce que pour les gens qui viennent là pour les entretenir, pour les surveiller, un peu d'investissement aussi, même si on est par essence dans des solutions fondées sur la nature, comme le rappelait Margherita. Donc, c'est pas neutre financièrement. Il faut trouver les moyens financiers de gérer ces zones humides et à tout le moins de les protéger avec des arguments socio-économiques. Et c'était un peu le sens de l'intervention de notre collègue Constantin de Sacasse, et puis c'était aussi l'intervention de Jean Jalbert, de valoriser ces zones humides, de voir ce qu'elles nous rapportent et ce qu'on perdrait à les perdre. Donc, il y a tout un champ d'évaluation socio-économique qu'on a un petit peu frôlé aujourd'hui, mais qui est très important et qui est au cœur de ce qu'on fait aussi au Plan Bleu, pour essayer de donner du prix à de la valeur. Voilà, les zones humides, elles sont avec une très grande valeur, mais il faut leur associer un prix pour pouvoir les protéger des appétits de ceux qui veulent les aménager et les détruire. Et puis, de façon peut-être plus positive, on l'a vu d'un slide avec Margherita sur la gestion de la lagune de Venise, il faut aussi penser à l'éducation. Donc, sans revenir à du Nicolas Hulot dans le texte, je crois qu'on ne protège bien que ce qu'on connaît et on ne connaît bien que ce qu'on aime. Et donc, ces questions qui rentrent dans la gestion globale d'une gouvernance des zones humides, il faut les intégrer en amont et il faut toujours faire ce travail de long terme, j'allais dire d'évangélisation, de formation, de sensibilisation pour leur protection demain. Voilà, donc vous voyez, les zones humides, c'est quelque chose de complexe qui ne se réduit pas à une carte postale ou à une image d'Épinal, de roselière ou de flamant rose. Alors là, on a parlé aujourd'hui de biodiversité, plutôt biodiversité terrestre, même si les zones humides commencent à être impactées par la remontée des eaux. Donc on est à la limite de la biodiversité terrestre et marine maintenant. Sachez que notre prochain rendez-vous du Plan Bleu, le 2 juillet prochain, eh bien, on va le faire sur les zones humides, cette fois-ci côté aires marines protégées. Donc, on a parlé un petit peu de Posidonie. On va parler des aires marines protégées la prochaine fois, le 2 juillet, et vous montrer des problèmes un peu analogues qu'on a de préservation de ces aires marines protégées en termes de gouvernance et surtout de financement. Donc, on va finir le point sur question de biodiversité terrestre et marine avec nos amis du Centre d'expertise régionale des Nations Unies pour l'environnement de Tunis, ce qu'on appelle le SPARAC dans notre jargon, qui viendront nous parler de leur expertise et qui viendront aussi nous parler du sud du bassin méditerranéen dont on entend trop peu parler. Donc là, aujourd'hui, on a parlé de Venise, on a parlé de la Camargue. La prochaine fois, on parlera plutôt du golfe de Gadès. Donc à bientôt le 2 juillet. Et puis enfin, et pour terminer, j'ai commencé ce rendez-vous du Plan Bleu en vous parlant de la Journée mondiale de l'environnement. Mais évidemment, si on est avec la Tour du Valat aujourd'hui, c'est pour leur fêter un bon anniversaire, puisqu'ils ont 70 ans d'âge. Voilà, ça sera fêté fin juin, je crois. Donc, mon cher Jean et toute ton équipe, on vous souhaite bon anniversaire, nous, Plan Bleu. Et puis, on vous souhaite le meilleur et une longue vie. Cher Jean, qu'est-ce qu'on peut te souhaiter avant de conclure ?
Eh bien, écoute, je pense que tu as souhaité l'essentiel. Merci beaucoup d'abord pour tes bons voeux, parce qu'effectivement, 70 ans, c'est un marqueur important dans la vie d'une organisation. Une organisation qui est partie d'une petite, on s'appelait station biologique de la Tour du Valat pendant longtemps, on était vraiment une station de terrain. On attrapait des oiseaux, on les baguait, on les relâchait. Aujourd'hui, on est une organisation d'une centaine de collaborateurs et avec un continuum qui va de la recherche à la gestion, au transfert des connaissances et puis à l'influence politique. Et il me semble qu'on est vraiment toutes les facettes que tu as citées à l'instant, Robin, disent bien la complexité justement de ce milieu-là, disent bien la nécessité d'être dans des passerelles, de lancer des passerelles un peu dans toutes les directions, de tisser des relations, des partenariats avec des organisations qui ne sont pas forcément de notre monde ou pour lesquelles nous ne sommes pas forcément bien outillés pour mettre en œuvre ces partenariats, mais c'est bien là l'enjeu. C'est face à la complexité, il n'y a pas de solution simple, on l'a vu, face à chaque situation, il y a des réponses spécifiques, tant en termes de gouvernance que de process, que d'approche, y compris, c'est vrai que cette dimension éducative, on l'a juste effleurée, mais c'est une dimension critique. Comment est-ce qu'on cette corde sensible, on a souvent une approche un peu trop technique. Je pense que c'est par le cœur et les tripes qu'on fera en sorte que ces zones humides seront sauvées, que les générations à venir y trouveront du plaisir, et plus qu'un plaisir, une impérieuse nécessité à les conserver pour continuer à garder ce lien assez unique entre l'humanité et notre environnement. Donc voilà, je pense encore une fois un très grand merci à toi, Robin, et à toute ton équipe, à Antoine, à Arnaud et à tout le monde au Plan Bleu. Le Plan Bleu est une organisation absolument nécessaire en Méditerranée. Si on ne l'avait pas, il faudrait l'inventer. Mais heureusement, on l'a et c'est un partenaire de choix. Donc voilà, un très grand merci pour à la fois ce que vous faites, mais aussi ces rendez-vous du Plan Bleu qui sont des moments importants, des moments de partage justement où on lance ces passerelles, où on tisse ces relations. Voilà, encore un très grand merci à toi. Merci à tous ceux qui ont suivi ce séminaire, ce webinaire que j'ai trouvé passionnant.
Au plaisir. À bientôt, les amis, et puis bonne fin de journée.
Au revoir à tous et grand merci.
Bye bye.